The hated Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria has fallen. Peace is now breaking out throughout the Middle East, and validation and victorious views for all of the efforts the United States has been doing to try to overthrow that dictatorial regime. And now the people of Syria are finally going to have the peace they have always longed for. Or at least that's the version that a lot of people in the West want to tell you. As a matter of fact, they want to go even further, and they want to see this is the validation of why the use of force is so important. And you just got to keep doing more of it, and even more good things will come. We'll see about that. But to try to make sense of what actually is going on, as opposed to these crazy narratives that are rolling around, we have one of the absolute best Middle Eastern sources, somebody who was an ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the region, Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Mr. Ambassador, as always, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be with you, Danny.
Well, listen, I've really been looking forward to this one because I've been seeing a lot of the statements coming out of a number of high-level U.S. officials and pundits who self-style themselves as being experts. But some things just don't quite seem right to me. So I've been looking forward to having you on today. And one of the first things I want to look at is who is this Jolani, Al Jolani, who's the leader of the HTS group that really launched this lightning strike that in basically a week completely unseated Bashar al-Assad. Now, looking at a lot of the things that are said in public, there was a CNN interview with him 4 or 5 days ago, to where he looks very rational, very calm. He's talking about, hey, in the past, I used to be, this kind of a firebrand or so, but, over time I have moderated. And listen, we're going to protect the Druze, the Christians, all the minorities. We just want good governance. That's what this is all about. And so he's being hailed in many parts of the Western world as, okay, well, great. This is somebody that's really good. But as we were talking about before we came on the air, you said there's a little more to the story than
that. He is 42 years old. He spent some time in a prison in Iraq under our auspices. He was a participant in beheading people earlier. He is a very clever politician, obviously. He's put together a plausible story. And as you said, suddenly these terrorists, and we have a $10 million bounty on his head. I mean, is this a great country or not? We can simultaneously have a bounty on his head and then offer him money to help reconstruct Syria. I mean, you can't get any better than that. But this movement that he heads, which now sounds very reasonable and which some people in the West have embraced as liberal, democratic-minded jihadis, sort of a contradiction in terms, if you will, is really unknown. He's saying all the right things. I think there are a number of things we need to bear in mind. One is, with a lot of help from the Turks and the Israelis, and I presume us as well, he built a very modern conventional fighting force. These were not insurgents. They had tanks, they had artillery, they had drones from Ukraine. Ukrainians obviously being happy about doing something to knock the Russians out of a place like Syria. And the speed with which he advanced was aided by the fact that the Bashar al-Assad government had essentially rotted from within. It's significant that the surrender of that government, the announcement of the departure of the Assads, first for the UAE and then for political asylum in Russia, was announced by the head of the Syrian National Army. As he left Syria, Bashar al-Assad commanded the peaceful transfer of power to the incoming group. All very well and good. But the Archbishop for the region has just said this is probably the end of Christianity in Syria. I don't think he trusts the kind words that Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, or his real name is Ahmed bin Hussein Shara, has been giving. And I think there probably is great fear in the Alawite community, which was the clan that the religious group that the outgoing Bashar al-Assad family belonged to, and which they favored, they must be very frightened now of retribution. So I don't think we know what's going to happen. But one thing, several impacts are obvious. First, this is a hardline Sunni government, whether it's kind to Christians, Druze, Jews, and Shia or not. It is anti-Iranian. It therefore serves the Israeli purpose of breaking the logistical supply lines between Iran and Lebanon, Hezbollah. Hezbollah has withdrawn from Syria. So have the Iranians. This is therefore something new and different, and we don't know how it's going to evolve. The initial performance has been impressive. Not only was the advance on Damascus and its capture largely bloodless, but the planning that went into this is extensive, and you can see it in the protection of government buildings and other sites in Damascus, unlike, I should say, the shambles that we created in our advance on Baghdad. There has been some looting, but it has been minimal. The big winners from this are Israel, which has successfully broken the supply lines for Hezbollah, and of course earlier had driven Hamas literally underground, not broken it, but greatly reduced its capacity to cause Israeli difficulties. Israel is able now to complete its genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza without an attack from Hezbollah, because Hezbollah has signed on to a phony ceasefire, which the Israelis continue to break, over 120 violations, I believe, as of yesterday. Basically, this is just a time Hezbollah agreed to it in order to reconstitute itself. Israel was getting chewed up pretty badly on the ground in southern Lebanon, and it wanted a ceasefire for that reason. But it has reserved the right to violate the ceasefire, which makes it not a ceasefire at all. Turkey is a huge winner from this. It will now have freedom to go after the Kurds, whom we support in northeastern and eastern Syria. I suspect that the new government will go after our presence, which is illegal. We have some 900 troops on the ground in Syria. And
Gary, if you can toss that map up on the screen right now, I want to put this up there because it's related to.
I think you see that. You see that we are down in the just about where the chart with the colors intersects with the map on the border, Jordan, Syria, Iraq border. But the yellow in that is the Kurds. Israel has had several long-term objectives. The major one has been to fragment Syria so that it is no longer a unified state, and Israel can practice divide and rule in what was Syria. It has also had the objective, as I mentioned, of breaking the supply lines for Hezbollah. This doesn't really affect Hamas because those supply lines didn't go through Syria. The Houthis remain active against Israel. The Turkish objectives are several. First, they have never really reconciled themselves to the 1923 treaty by which they ceded what is now northern Syria to the new state of Syria. And they may well want to annex territory in Syria. The Israelis.
I'm sorry, Gary, can you throw that map back up there? I wanted to ask a question. So in this map that we see here, the green, the kind of the
light green.
Light green. Sorry, yeah. In the top, there's two little bands of it there. That's where they currently are. How much further might they want to go?
I don't know. Originally, Aleppo was part of Turkey, but I think they probably won't do that. But they want to push the Kurds at least back from the border. They now have an Islamist government, congenial Islamist government, apparently about to take power in Syria. They want to get rid of the 3.5 million refugees they have on their soil from Syria. They've been very patient, but their patience has been running out. And if they can, they'll finish off the Kurds and subdue them because they are aligned with the terrorist PKK insurgents inside Turkey.
Now that's going to put them. That's going to put them into conflict with alleged United States objectives, some of which we're going to hear shortly.
Yes.
But we're supposed to be supporting all the Syrian democratic forces, not the terrorists that the Turkey's talking about here. And in that map, you can see there's a pretty substantial swath of territory right now where the Kurds are. That whole yellow section up there.
Exactly.
Is it conceivable that Turkey would want to literally take them all out, or are they just going to tell them to move further south? How do you see that possibly playing out?
Well, I suspect they'll emulate the Israelis with some form of ethnic cleansing along the border, at least, maybe genocide. That now seems to be acceptable internationally. Nobody does anything about it in the case of Israel. I want to just note on the U.S. angle to this, that from the very beginning of the Syrian state after World War II, the United States has attempted on multiple occasions to do regime change in Syria. The first attempt was actually in 1947, really at the very outset of the creation of the CIA. There have been multiple attempts ever since the Assad family took power. That was basically the beginning of the 1970s. There were attempts in the 60s, and of course, Hillary Clinton and company tried it again in this century. We always failed. Now we've succeeded. And here we come to the adage that you should be very careful what you wish for because you may get it. I know that all of the secular governments in the Arab world and adjacent areas, all of the pro-American governments have been overthrown or alienated. Libya, which was a secular state where men and women had equality and the state did not impose a religion on the populace, is now divided between various Islamist factions. Syria has just gone Islamist. Afghanistan is under the Taliban. The Gulf Arabs have been alienated and threatened by our policies. Iran in 1979-80 had an Islamist revolution. So what is happening in a broad sense is the repudiation of the Western idea of secularism, with only Egypt under a military dictatorship still practicing it. If this is an achievement, well, I'm not sure it was worth it. Anyway.
And let me ask you, on that topic, what do you think the impact is going to be? We're going to look at some of these other actors in a minute, but specifically on the other regimes in the area. Let's say Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. We'll start with those three. What impact will this have on their governance and anything internal to their rule?
Well, interestingly enough, secularism, as practiced by the Ba'ath Party in Syria or before it in Iraq, before our invasion and regime change operation, it had no attraction whatsoever in places like Saudi Arabia, and it was essentially irrelevant in places like Jordan and Egypt. That is, Egypt tried on several occasions to achieve unity with Syria in the United Arab Republic. This failed in part because of differences over religion. Ironically, as I said, Egypt is now under a secular military dictatorship. The problem now is that the Salafist regime in Syria, if it practices democracy, which it has claimed it will, that is to say, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani has stressed that he is turning over the government to an elected government in Syria. If the Muslim Brotherhood tendencies that failed in Egypt and were overthrown with a military coup with our support, now establish themselves in Syria, then that does have ideological attraction to the undemocratic regimes in the Persian Gulf. So a lot depends on what happens. What does this new regime do? Does it persecute all the religious minorities who inhabit Syria, the Christians, the Druze? There's still a substantial Jewish population in Damascus. What's it going to do with these groups? What about the Alawites and other Shia?
Right.
We don't know. And we also don't know whether they're seriously going to try to introduce an Islamist democracy, which I'm sure the Turks will favor. And the Turks have now got great influence in Syria. I want to note also that in the last days of the Bashar al-Assad government, both Turkey and Russia, on multiple occasions, attempted to persuade Mr. Assad to make peace with the jihadis, and he declined. He basically controlled 70% of Syrian territory, and he thought it was up to the other side to compromise, not him. Now he's gone. And I think one of the reasons he's gone is basically his patrons, Turkey and Russia, and especially Russia, gave up on him. And Iran proved powerless to help him. One of the major effects of this really seismic change in the region is that it leaves Iran naked in front of Israeli striking power. And Iran has now lost its frontline deterrent capabilities that had been supplanted by Hezbollah and Hamas. And it is now directly confronting Israel. And we know that in the days prior to this stunning development, more and more Iranians were openly advocating that Iran actually build the nuclear weapon that it has not tried to build. And I suspect those pressures are now intense because Iran needs a deterrent against Israel and the United States. And I suspect we will see it take the path of North Korea and develop its own nuclear deterrent. And that deterrent will probably be capable of striking the United States as well as Israel. So I'm not sure that this is the joyous moment that so many people depict it as. And I find it really ironic that our outgoing president, Mr. Biden, would celebrate the end of the secular regime in Syria without asking the question, what is going to follow it? I learned a long time ago when I was a kid in law school and I was disgusted with the Diem regime in South Vietnam, and Mr. Diem was assassinated by us. I thought, hooray, now there will be better days. And there was an old, hard-bitten Cuban guy who was retraining himself as a lawyer at the Harvard Law School at the time. He'd been ransomed out of Cuba for a tractor. And he said to me, why are you happy? Do you know what's going to come next? Why do you assume the next guy is going to be more effective than the one you just got rid of? And I would say in the case of Syria, we don't have any idea what is going to happen. And I would add a final point, and that is we're not even talking to the various parties that might know. Iran, Turkey. Turkey may be a member of NATO, but we are deeply estranged. We don't talk to the Russians. Antony Blinken, in his 4 years in office, has not once visited Moscow. Sergei Lavrov last came to Washington 5 years ago. There is no diplomacy. We exchange combative talking points with the Chinese. We don't listen to each other. We don't have a dialogue. We have a show. And so the outgoing Biden administration is bequeathing to its successor an incredible number of very fluid, potentially disastrous situations, two of them already possible points of origin for a nuclear exchange, Ukraine, the Taiwan Strait, and Iran, I think now much more likely to go nuclear than it ever was before, for the reasons I mentioned. And we have an incoming administration that also inherits a constitutional crisis, the collapse of due process, the erosion of the rule of law, the removal of many of the protections in the Bill of Rights, in practice, a divided government, which is polarized in the Congress, a politicized Supreme Court, and a president who doesn't seem to have any regard for rules, except those he makes up on the spur of the moment. So this is going to be a very interesting period, Danny.
Well, and one of the pressures I think that are going to be put on the new administration, I think certainly one Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be eager to try and test some bounds. Here's how he replied or reacted after Assad fell.
This is a historic day in the history of the Middle East. The Assad regime is a central link to Iran's axis of evil. This regime has fallen. This is a direct result of the blows we inflicted on Iran and Hezbollah, the major supporters of the Assad regime. This created a chain reaction throughout the Middle East of all those who wanted to be freed from this regime of oppression and tyranny.
So you see, there's a couple of subtle things he's doing there. Is number one, he's saying this is all our fault. This is all we get the credit for. All the stuff that we have done for you.
Well,
it's good for you. It's for the whole region. So maybe we should do a little more.
No, I think the other part of this, which he doesn't mention, is Israel immediately took advantage of this by seizing more territory in Syria, taking it from the UN, which had a UN Security Council mandated peacekeeping force on the Israeli-Syrian border. They had a DMZ, a demilitarized zone. Israel seized that. That is a total contravention of international law, and once again giving the Security Council the bird, which Israel seems to like to do. It has
Gary,
among
can you
other
bring
things,
that map up that shows where the area he's talking about? Yeah, that's the one right there. You see that
well,
thatched area? That's what that's
you
recently.
see the barred area there. That is the neutral area that was patrolled by the UN, which is now occupied by Israel, another part of Syria. Of course, nobody internationally but the United States recognizes Israelis' annexation of the Golan Heights, which is a sort of grayish blue thing between Syria and Israel. We recognize it. No one else does. That was something that President Trump did in his first term in office. So,
how far do you think Israel will go? How much territory might they gobble up?
Well, here's the interesting thing. The Syrian Organization for the Liberation of Syria, which is what Hayat Tahrir al-Sham means, is very similar to the religious Zionist movement in Israel that now controls Israel. It's religiously fanatic. It believes that it is entitled to take all of what is now Israel back from the Jewish state. It is, in fact, the head of Mr. Al Jolani, the head of the victorious group, although he apparently promised Israel that in return for its help organizing the campaign, which Mr. Netanyahu was sufficiently graceful not to take direct credit for, he would recognize the state of Israel. But at the same time, he has told his own followers that having taken Damascus, the next step is to take Jerusalem. So this is full of contradictions. And as I said at the beginning, the United States has really done a remarkable thing. On the one hand, we have a State Department reward of $10 million for taking the head of Mr. Al Jolani. On the other hand, we have the CIA and now the White House offering to help Mr. Al Jolani. You can't get more contradictory than that.
And speaking of the United States, there are those who want to take immediate advantage of this. And we had General Jack Keane, doing his best to provide expert commentary on what Trump should do when he comes in.
Iran. We have the opportunity now to neutralize this regime once and for all. Why? Just look at what happened. Hamas and Hezbollah are decimated. Their number one strategic client in the region, which was enabling them to dominate and control the region, is Syria. They just lost it. They are completely defenseless at home. They have a weak conventional military, and they have no air defense system to protect their strategic assets. What President Trump can do coming into power is issue an ultimatum along with the Prime Minister of Israel and the Arab nations to the Iranian leader and tell them, number one, you are going to dismantle your nuclear enterprise. You are going to stop providing assistance to your proxies. The alternative, maximum toughest sanctions that will bankrupt your country. Number two, surgical kinetic strikes to cripple your nuclear enterprise and to destroy the remaining rockets and missiles. Can we do it diplomatically, or do we have to do it kinetically?
How's that? You said you wanted to have more diplomacy. So Jack Keene's saying, how about this for diplomacy?
Well, several comments. First, the assumption that Arab nations would be with us in that is extremely mistaken. In fact, for precisely the reasons I mentioned earlier, namely their distaste for the kind of Salafi Islam that has now taken hold in Syria and the threat that this ideology potentially poses to them, they are moving closer to Iran, not away from it. And they now see Iran as an essential balancer of Israel, which has achieved a kind of supremacy in the Levant. Now, nobody in the Gulf has any affection for Hezbollah or Hamas. They objected to Hamas because it was a democratic movement brought to power by elections, which they don't have in their countries, and they object to that form of government. They were against Hezbollah because it was both Shia, not Sunni, and opposed to their influence in Lebanon. They disliked Syria, but let's note that they, after many efforts on their part to engineer regime change, overthrow the Assad government in Damascus, they had made their peace with Assad, reestablished diplomatic relations, were engaged in a dialogue with the Syrians. So I think he's completely out to lunch on that. And I'll just finally note that he just made the best case you could possibly make for the Iranians to build a nuclear weapon. And, the idea that somehow we can run around the world bombing and strafing and occupying countries and invading them at will, and there are no consequences for us or for our friends, is just wrong. And, we're $8 trillion in the hole as a result of pouring a lot of money into the desert sands of Iraq and the wastelands of Afghanistan. Now let's go after Iran. That makes real sense. It's not like we don't have any problems at home to fix. I suggest we do. And I think Mr. Trump was elected not to start a new war, contrary to General Keane, but he was elected in response to grave dissatisfaction by the American people with the existing situation in our country. And if he can't fix that, he's not going to last very long as a legitimate leader of our nation.
Yeah, and to your point there, just in the news a couple of days ago, one of the IAEA officers said that, look, Iran has been ramping up its production of near weapons grade. In fact, they've been dramatically increasing the stockpile of weapons grade or near weapons grade uranium at 60%. Apparently, it's just a short jump to 90%, which is necessary. Right. And so the question has to be, now, well, here's the point. I think a lot of Jack Keane will probably be the first one to bring that up and say, oh, my God, see, this is why we have to go after them now. So how can Iran try to navigate where they are with, as you just artfully described, the fact that they've been eviscerated personally? Now all of their support structures with their proxies has also been gutted. To rely on the United States to not do anything or to go down this path. And to me, it seems like the chances are getting higher, if not close to probable, that is where they're going.
I don't know what other choices they have. I note as well that while Russia has been driven from Syria, we don't know whether the Russians will be able to retain their naval base at Tartus, which they're negotiating with the new authorities to retain. It may be that they will be out because the Russians have been fighting this very movement and very much allied with the former government in Damascus, and they may not be able to hold on to any foothold in the country, although they've been close to Syria now for many decades. So we don't know, but the Russians are closer and closer to Iran, and they share something in common, which is a common enmity of the United States. and the war in Ukraine and the pressure the United States has put on Iran, which is very strong. It's not that we haven't had maximum pressure on Iran. We have. This has brokered a relationship between Russia and Iran that is now ever stronger. And if air defenses were, in fact, severely damaged, as the Israelis claim, I think Russia's in a position to replace those, notwithstanding the combat in Ukraine, which continues to go in the direction of the Russians. So, there are now, I see, Mr. Trump flew to Paris for the reopening of Notre Dame Cathedral, and he'd met Mr. Zelensky and apparently strongly pressed him for a ceasefire. I don't think the Russians want a ceasefire. They're winning. I don't think they want a DMZ in Ukraine. They don't want an armistice. They want a peace. That means Ukraine and Russia are going to have to negotiate a border. That means Ukraine and Russia and other European countries and the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, the OSCE, Security and Cooperation in Europe, this organization and others are going to have to negotiate the status of oppressed minorities in Ukraine, Russian speakers, Hungarian speakers, Romanian speakers, others who have been deprived of their rights to use their own language to educate their kids or communicate with local governments. And finally, most important, there needs to be some structure that can reestablish and sustain peace in Europe. And that can't begin with a DMZ dividing Europe. We saw what happened in Korea. We signed an armistice, we built a DMZ, and the war never ended. It's still there. And the danger of combat is palpable. And anyone who has been to the DMZ and looked over that expanse into North Korea has a strong sense of how tense things are, how dangerous they are, how fragile the absence of war is. We can't afford to have that in Europe.
Right.
So now we need to confront, we don't need a ceasefire. Of course, the Ukrainians need to stop dying in the numbers they are. That is true. But we're probably going to have a Korean-style negotiation where the fighting continues as the negotiation proceeds. And there won't be a ceasefire that starts it. And I think, this is urgent. This requirement is urgent. And doing something to readjust our relations with Europe, so we're not on the front line. Europeans are, as Mr. Trump has argued, paying their own way in their own defense, taking responsibility for it, backed by us. We have to rearrange all this. And it's time to do it. The Biden administration is, however, piling everything it can into perpetuating the war in Ukraine so that Mr. Trump will take the blame when it ends on terms that they can criticize.
Yeah, unfavorable to the Kiev side, which is ridiculous to even think anything else is going to come out of it. But there also the outgoing administration is trying to do things to tie the hands of the incoming administration in the Middle East as well. Now, one of the things I have been arguing since at least 2019 in public, the things that I've written, gone on Fox News, et cetera, is that we need to get our troops out of Iraq, Syria. They never should have been there at all. As you've said many times, it's completely illegal by any rules-based orders. It's certainly any legal basis. But Jake Sullivan went on TV this weekend actually and said, hey, it's a great deal, and we have done so many good things because of this.
We have a presence both in Iraq and in Syria. That presence in Syria is there to work hand in hand with local partners to continue to suppress the threat that ISIS has posed going back many years now. And we've had significant progress in that fight just even in the last few months. Major players taken off the battlefield, large-scale degradation of those ISIS forces. But of course, an event like this happens, and ISIS immediately looks to take advantage. And we have seen reports of ISIS trying out in the Syrian Badia, the desert, to try to reconstitute to a certain extent. So we will continue to take action against that. And we will continue to make sure that force protection, the protection of our service members who are serving at a range of bases in eastern Syria, is the paramount concern from the president on down. The threat to those service members is not just from ISIS or from this violence. It is also from Iranian-backed Shia militia groups who themselves could try to take advantage of this. And so we are also doing what we believe we need to do to prepare for, deter, and protect against any potential attacks from that group of actors, which, of course, we have seen over the course of the past few years, and which we, under the Biden administration, have responded to at several points with direct strikes against those forces, both in Syria and in Iraq.
That is, it's just beggars imagination to be able to actually make a case that those troops there do amazing things for the United States here. I'm not aware of anything except for strategic vulnerability. What say you?
Well, I note, first of all, that President Trump in his first term made a valiant effort to remove those troops, and he was essentially blocked by the deep state. And I don't think he's going to allow himself to be blocked again. Second point, the opposition to that presence is from nationalists of one sort or another in Syria. They are reacting just the way Texans would react if there were a Chinese army occupying part of Texas. Third, we are present in Iraq, but the Iraqi parliament keeps voting to get us out, and we keep finding a way to hang on. We should not be where we are not welcome and where we are vulnerable. We should not be in violation of international law. We should be in support of it. And everything about that deployment in Syria is wrong, and it has to end.
Yeah, but I guess they're going to try to make the case that, again, I guess if Trump comes in and does what he tried to do in 2019, that, he's going to be bashed upon this by, probably even Jack Keane's going to say, no, he should continue going down this route here. But the last thing I want to talk about in the time we have left is the Russia aspect of this in the Middle East here. Not just the naval base that you just mentioned a second ago and some air bases that they also have, but also in their relations with Iran. How do you see Russia being affected by all of this one way or the other?
Well, it's clearly lost a great deal of prestige. Its intervention in Syria was limited, but had an enormous effect. It made Russia, in many ways, the go-to country for many diplomatic purposes in the region. Unlike Mr. Sullivan, who appears to conceive of foreign policy as a purely military exercise, talking about force protection and working with local partners to have a U.S. presence illegally in another country. The Russians are very conscious of the geopolitical dimensions of and implications of their military presences in the region. That presence in Syria has just ended, basically. Even if they retain the bases, they're not going to be in league with the government in Damascus, which has no reason to love them, nor they it. Under Russian policy, the group that has just taken power, like it's exactly the same as the United States, is branded as a terrorist group. And until proven otherwise, the Russians are going to continue to regard it as such. So I think they've lost a serious foothold. What is the alternative foothold for them? It is a strengthened relationship with Iran. And so they're not going to leave the Middle East. We have successfully cut them off from much of their relationship with Europe, and they have turned to China, India, and the Middle East and Africa. They're active in all of those places. They're not going to stop being active, and Russia's not going to disappear from the region, although it will not be in Syria. And it may, as I suggested earlier, given the recalcitrance of Mr. Assad, his refusal to negotiate peace with other factions in Syria, they may feel well rid of him. And, he'll have a nice dacha somewhere outside Moscow or in Sochi or someplace in Russia. I don't think we're going to hear much from him again. But Syria will have its politics. A final point here, and that is, there are reasons to be delighted, as many Syrians are, perhaps most of them, about the demise of the Assad government and regime, for many reasons. I'll just tell you a story. The first time I went to Syria, I was in Saudi Arabia, and I asked a Syrian Saudi friend what I needed to know about Syria before I went. And he said, well, do you know about the Special Forces Olympics? I said, I didn't know about those. No, he said, every 4 years, the commandos of the world's armies get together and they have a contest to see who is the most proficient at special operations. And this year, he said, it came out as a tie, the Russians, the Americans, and the Syrians, was the Soviets still then. And he said, so they set up a contest. They all assembled at the edge of a forest, and they were told to go into the forest and catch a rabbit with their bare hands. And after a little while, the Soviet came out holding a rabbit by the ears, and then the American came out holding a rabbit by the ears. But the Syrian didn't come out. And so the sun began to go down. They began to get quite worried what had happened to him. They went into the forest, and they found him holding a donkey by the ears, beating it and saying, confess you are a rabbit, confess you are a rabbit. This is kind of thing that was just seen overthrown. And, good riddance to it on that level. But its removal opens Pandora's box in terms of what could happen in future in Syria and between Syria and its neighbors. So I think we should be very cautious and vigilant, not jubilant, not complacent, and not see what has happened as the vindication of anything we did. You could say, perhaps, Syrian forces, aided and abetted by the Turks and Israelis, and us and maybe the French, have seized control of their own destiny. But we don't know what their plans for that destiny are. And I don't think we have good channels of communication, despite our clandestine involvement in this enterprise.
Yeah, I have full confidence that we will do almost the opposite of what you suggested, that we will take all the credit in the world for this thing happening and say this validates continued regime change operations. And then when it goes south, if it does go south, then, well, that's somebody else's fault. But unfortunately, I doubt we'll learn any lessons from this. But I guess we have to keep hoping that, who knows, maybe this time it'll be different. For the people of Syria, I especially hope that this time is different, so that they at least have a chance to just breathe without always worrying about being oppressed or killed by some faction or another.
Exactly. And the country rebuilt and the refugees repatriated. But the opposite could happen. We could have a major exodus of people again from Syria.
Yeah, especially if these guys start acting on some of the things that they had done in the past about threatening these various groups. But we'll continue to monitor this. And thank you so much for coming on today to providing some clarity on something that's really complicated to a lot of people in the world right now. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
And thank you guys very much for coming and watching with us today. We always appreciate you. Be sure to remember that we are on our Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and you will find us waiting there. Also, let you know that we have some more good shows during this week. I believe on Wednesday, we're going to have Doug McGregor. And we've always got some other special guests that we're going to pop in here and there. But anything that happens in the world, you can count on Daniel Davis Deep Dive to bring you right up to date on what's happening. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next episode.